Warburton from Fujitsu. It's a great pleasure to be here today and talk to you about where I see the direction of mobility as we head forward through some fairly turbulent times. First of all, I'd like to share this image with you, which I think actually talks a lot to where I see the mobility agenda and the impact that COVID's had on recent times. If you think about a river, the direction of the river is something that's very difficult to alter and change. And if you think about COVID being a storm, what that storm has done has swelled the river. What we've now got is more intensity in that river and a greater speed in which that river is flowing. But the direction's still the same. But we're going to see in that river a number of boulders or rocks, the disruption that was already there, the disruption that was already part of the mobility world. And that in itself hasn't changed. Just the intensity of the change is what we're actually seeing. Now at Fujitsu, we look at the mobility agenda across these three key areas: consciousness, connectivity, and convergence. In consciousness, traditionally, we were looking at it from the point of view of the new buyer, the new consumer experience, the environmentally aware consumer, somebody who cared about the planet, somebody who didn't care quite so much about physically owning a vehicle. And that was something we were seeing a lot of. Now we see with COVID that accelerating. And why so? Well, if you think about it, if I'm furloughed at home, or if I'm now not commuting to the office, which most of us aren't doing, that's why we're on these connected meetings. Why do I need that vehicle that's sat in my driveway, that vehicle that I'm still paying a lease on? Why do I need the two vehicles? Because both myself and my wife or husband have that vehicle to our disposal. So then you start thinking about a different type of mobility agenda. Now, before I might not have considered mobility, I might consider it. So that consciousness has been accelerated in a different way. And then you start thinking about convergence. And convergence previously was really about the opportunity for companies to occupy the mobility agenda. And it was an option. It was a disruption. It was new entrants as well as some of the traditional players. But now we look at the traditional players, and let's take the example of an OEM. A car company that's seen their sales drop, they've seen their factories close during the period of shutdown of COVID. And you think about that, and you think about, well, if we move forward in time and they're in a world where instead of sitting there as a closed down factory, they were occupying the space of mobility, they could still have been earning revenue from things like last mile delivery services. They would be taking revenue from consumers who are buying a mobility service, and with that would come a whole bunch of different opportunities. So convergence is going to be accelerated by the need for companies to diversify revenue streams. And then connectivity, the fact that we're using these connected environments is putting pressure on the systems. It's going to accelerate the deployment of connectivity, the 5G networks, and all of the things that are there that underpin mobility. So what's COVID done? I believe it's swelled the river. I believe it's created greater intensity, and it's actually moving this agenda much further forward than we ever imagined it would do. And I look at the mega trends that sit around this, and some of these were there before COVID, but they're still relevant. 175 zettabytes of data expected to be generated by 2025. To put that into context, I think around 2015, it was about 2 zettabytes for the whole worldwide web traffic in that year. So it's an explosion of data, and the ability to harness and monetize that data becomes all important. China and the BRIC economies continuing to be the dominant forces and distorting factor in the world of automotive will continue. The move towards sharing we've talked about on the previous slide, and I think we're going to see more and more acceleration towards that as people start to consider their options. And then we're still going to see people moving towards mega cities and large metropolitan environments. That's still going to be what we expect to see as we move towards 2050. There's a little quote in the middle there, and it's Steve Jobs back in 2005. He's speaking for a bunch of bright young things at a commencement speech at Stanford. And you could read that on first level and think he's just encouraging these bright young people to think about what they can achieve in life. But really, what he's creating there is the start of what I see as the instant gratification society. A world where we wait for nothing, a world where we demand everything to be at our doorstep immediately. And again, what we're seeing in the changing world today is only intensified by our more recent experiences. It's important to break this down and to understand what we mean by digital transformation. And this is an area I find there's a lot of confusion. So I talked to a number of companies, a number of executives, and they talked to me about the connected or the autonomous vehicle being what they see as the digital transformation of the auto sector. I see it just as the enabling technology. I say just, a very important enabling technology, but enabling technology nonetheless. The outer layer is where the value is. Mobility as a service is a service. It's about the services agenda. It's feeding that instant gratification. It's attacking those 3 areas of consciousness, connectivity, and convergence. It's the opportunity to actually go and generate new revenue streams and grow in new ways. It's a service-orientated world. It's important to understand those two different key components. And if we drop onto the next slide, we look at what that looks like going forward. I break it down very simply, and it's probably overly simplified, but it kind of makes the point about directionally where we're traveling, where that river is traveling to as we move forward. 3-layer model. At the top layer, I see the mobility company. That's pure services companies. They don't own any assets. They're going to deliver the mobility services to us as the consumer. Those new customer experience models of the future, some of which we haven't even imagined yet, some of which are going to be developed in the same way when the smartphone was developed. The new applications came along, the new business models came along. We're going to see the same happen in that mobility area. And then pushing down underneath that, there's going to be a vehicle as a service layer. And those vehicles can be the automobile, they can be multiple forms of transportation. But let's just stick at the car at the moment. The car is going to be something that's sold as a service to the mobility companies. It's going to be a vehicle as a service layer that delivers those services. And so what they're going to want to do, because they're no longer selling the car, they're going to want to push the capital expenditure of the car down to the component manufacturers. So the component manufacturers then have to reinvent themselves as a service. They have to think differently about their customer experience model. Otherwise, they sit at the bottom as a commodity. So all the way through this, we see commodity at the bottom, services at the top, and that whole change is the digital transformation. Harnessing the data, monetizing the data, reinventing companies as a service. That fork in the road of being a traditional manufacturer and trying to reinvent and being more of a service-oriented company is key. It's important to embrace that. That is the essence of the digital transformation sector. So let me try and give an example of what I mean by the converged market, because it's easy to talk about converged mobility market. So I'm trying to make that come to life a little bit. So we imagine that I'm paying for a mobility company to provide me with my mobility services. And those mobility services are something I use all day in terms of either commuting to work or just for my personal life. But let's just take a commuter story. So my mobility service provider sends me a vehicle, an autonomous electric vehicle in the future, to pick me up from home and to take me to my office in Manhattan. I've got an office somewhere around about 46th and Lexington, in the center of Midtown. And so as this vehicle drops me off, drives me to the office, I might enjoy a retail therapy experience. I might do some online shopping. I might be watching my latest box set from my service provider. And either of those two things will be available to me in that vehicle. And then I get dropped off at work, and then I spend my day at work. And then at the end of the day, push a button and then I hail my vehicle to come and pick me up. I'll expect that to be about 90 seconds maximum before I'm satisfied with the vehicle to run me home. And that's the instant gratification world that I will be living in by the time this has become a reality. And as I get with confirmation of my pickup, it will say go to curbside location C5 on the corner of 46th and Lexington, which is a simple stroll down from my office. Or it might offer me an extra block down, go to curbside location D6, one block down. Why would I choose that? Well, it might be offering me a latte to be delivered at the curbside location from the local Starbucks, because that can be achieved at that location. So now we've monetized that curbside location, my ability to go there. New York City is taking money both in terms of when I was dropped off and when I was picked up, the time that vehicle was at that curbside location. As I travel home, I find that the mobility company has synchronized my pickup and anticipated my pickup based on my normal commuting behavior. And in a pod in the back of the vehicle, there's a pair of sneakers that I ordered while I was on my way to work in the morning. So as you can see, there's a lot of stakeholders in this new experience, this new customer experience model that I'm experiencing. And all of these different companies are joined by a platform, are joined by the technology and the services around that. So that's really what the converged market looks like in the future. Why worry about this now? Well, we've looked at the data. We believe that 2025 is the tipping point of change. That's when we see a lot of the indicators coming to a point where we're going to see the start of an S-curve of change for this marketplace. And as we go through that S-curve of change from 2025, it's only going to be lasting maximum about 5 years. If we look at recent experience and we look at how fast things like the smartphone revolution happened, it was around about 5 years. And the players that were the disruptors at the start weren't the winners at the end. That changed during the S-curve. So we look at that in the context of a now, near, far change. And the now being the transactional business we're doing today, the near being how we digitally transform, the far being the new ecosystem we go to. This is the opportunity. This is also the threat. This is what the companies need to embrace and the digital transformation we need to look at. So let's think about that now, near, far a little bit more. What do we mean by that? Well, it's really about breaking down your strategy into 3 very distinct layers. That now is, what do I need to be doing now to keep pace with the market? So it's all about electric vehicles. It's all about the connected vehicle, being able to update the vehicles over the year. It's all about the cyber security of that connected electric vehicle. In the near, it starts to become more about smart driving. It becomes about neutral server. It becomes about the data protection of the consumer, because they're going to start to adopt more of these consumer experiences, these new customer experience models. And in the future, we're in this urban services world. It's a very different world as we go through that 2025 to 2030. And that urban mobility will become a reality as we start to go forward. So just for fun, I wanted to just accelerate us into 2028. Let's just think about what that middle point of that 2025 to 2030 looks like. What are the sort of things we might be experiencing? Well, we've all heard of Greta Thunberg, the environmental campaigner, doing a great deal of good for the planet. But what about where she'll be in 2028? Well, maybe she's turned herself into an online business. Maybe she's delivering, I'll say, digital image of a yellow rain map that we can print at home on our 3D printer. So now that's the way that we start to consume some of our goods and clothing. It's intelligent mobility. It's no longer just smart mobility, now it's intelligent mobility. Transport for London have got rid of some of the tube trains because the commuter experience has changed. Now we end up with super highways with things like scooters and autonomous rides and bicycles underground inside those tunnels. And also maybe we think about vertical farming. Maybe the city of New York has now got 20 of these vertical farms across the Manhattan area. So now actually, rather than bringing food in, food is actually grown in that environment. A little bit of fun, a little bit of thinking in the future, but the important thing to understand here is this is intelligent mobility. Intelligent mobility is a natural progression from smart mobility. The kind of scary but exciting thing is what we're all experiencing now is intelligent mobility. We have jumped across smart mobility into a world of intelligent mobility. We're already consuming this type of experience and it's becoming normal. So that means that trajectory of the river, the direction that we're taking, that's not changing, it's accelerating. That flow that's coming from the intensity that comes from COVID, that's just going to accelerate this agenda faster. So the important thing, I think, is to be ready and to actually take those now, near, far steps and start to drive change. Thank you.
So, Paul, thank you very much for joining us. Fascinating talk, very optimistic in terms of the view that you're sharing. Intelligent mobility, some would say contrarian view, given the current state. And in fact, one of the questions was, does your view of the future change if the pandemic is longer in intensity, or is it sort of still the same? Is it just a hiccup on a journey to a distant destination?
Yeah, I see that. Yeah, no, it's a fair question, a good question. It doesn't change. I think that the intensity that we're seeing just increases, but in a different way, and the consumer starts to drive the change, whereas before the pandemic, it was more driven by the business. The consumer ultimately would drive the change, but I think that consumer behaviors are starting to change. And I think mobility just becomes part of that. And so now I don't think my thoughts change if the pandemic runs longer. I think it adjusts quite how we adopt it, but I think it's all the same. We'll have greater intensity towards that direction.
So you would still stick with 2025 being the point of inflection on your S curve?
Yeah, and in fact, the interesting part could be that the intensity brings that date forward. I mean, 2025 is a reasonable tipping point, and a lot of what we see. But in certain ways, that intelligent mobility starts to become real. What we're doing today is part of intelligent mobility. So it's a different way for us to communicate and connect with each other. And I think if an elongated pandemic could force us to think differently about how we see our personal mobility, and also the additional mobility, the opportunities. We're already seeing things being delivered to our homes more readily, and that happening as part of a mobility society.
I mean, you're focused very much on the consumer experience, which I fundamentally believe is the right thing. It's about sort of adoption, and so it's the right technology at the right time. As in some ways, a lot of the online e-commerce is happening in Western Europe and the US, which happened much earlier in Asia because of the SARS impact. But I wonder, you're certainly the shared economy, I think people are more concerned about, but I wonder whether the fear and the requirement or the intention to try and escape dense areas and infection would actually sort of drive against the mega trends of mobility and megacities.
Yeah, and that's again a fair question. I think there's a number of factors here. You're going to see some people move away who can work from home and decide to work from home, and the commute to the office becomes less important. But I think you're going to see retail environments and office buildings turning over to a more social housing type environment. So you're going to sort of see almost a change in terms of the demographic of large cities. But all the same, I still think you're going to see people inside those large cities. And it will be a different way of living if we continue with this kind of pandemic or even post-pandemic. I think that new world that we've all got used to will force that change in behavior. And again, I think that's why focusing on the customer experience is important, accepting the fact that the consumer is going to drive the momentum much harder than they were before. But what you're articulating is correct. I think there could be a change for some, but that gap will get filled by others.
I mean, you emphasize the sort of service-led framework and services, and in many respects a service ecosystem. If you take a vehicle as a service, does that mean it's now no longer like an Uber and a Lyft? It's more like a Zip car, and what needs to happen to sort of enable that in your mind? Yeah,
I think it's more about people getting used to paying for a monthly subscription as opposed to paying on usage, and that subscription will be built around their personal needs and the services that they want to see. And so very similar to taking a contract on a smartphone rather than a pay-as-you-go type relationship. That's the type of change that we'll see trip over. And once you start to see that change and the loyalty that comes around that, then you start to see that broader ecosystem really start to build. So yeah, I think that's the change. I think we will see a move towards people taking more of a subscription-based service rather than pay on usage.
I mean, I was interested in terms of, many years ago when I was in strategy, one of the things we would do is sort of mock up the front page of, say, Business Week of what the future looks like under these circumstances. But you talked about sort of news feeds. Who do you see as the winners in this space going forward?
I think it's the companies that are brave enough to kind of embrace that change. It's a services-orientated world that we're moving towards, and so companies that are really well set for that, companies that play in the world of services today, the manufacturers moving to that, it's a much bigger jump. It's a culture jump for their companies, and this is not the time to kind of hold back and not be brave. I think we have to be in some way measured in our response to the change, and we have to be watching those tipping points to see the direction. But I think the winners are going to be companies who can move to, or already are, a services oriented company that can then leverage the technology, leverage the assets in their favor and to the consumer's favor. So
Paul, unfortunately we are out of time. But thank you for sharing your view and for being so optimistic. So thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you. My pleasure.
I think we're done. Thanks, Paul.
We're done? Excellent. Thanks very much. Appreciate your time.